Welcome to the Security Champions podcast. I'm your host, Michael Birch, and I am joined today with Adam Bruehl. Now, Adam Bruehl actually works here at Security Journey, but he has some very interesting insights into secure coding and actually the medical industry, which will be the core of our topic. But before we start talking about that, Adam, how about we talk about what has been your security journey and gotten you to where you are now?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have been tinkering around on computers since basically I was a child, right? I was blessed enough to have the cable internet when it first came into the house. So not quite the dial-up. That's what my neighbor had, who was a little older than me. Gen X right there. That was my neighbor. But I've always tinkered around. Kind of where I really got into it was college. So, kind of my original plan for where I wanted to go in life was actually biology, and to be more specific, bioinformatics. And so, you start out genetics, you start out biology, you start out, biochemistry, all that good stuff. But then in the end, you have to have a little bit of a software background. And so, as part of that, I ended up, yeah, great. I was majoring in biology, but I'm like, let me do our CMIT, which was basically computer science light, right? It's the how do I get a job in computer science without going into the deep, like, let me do a kernel, let me do a compiler. So it was the kind of the more blue collar course. And so I ended up doing both of those, as well as working for our campus IT department. And through the course of that, I ended up being trusted well enough to get being the network Sherpa and one of the administrators, getting a full set of keys to the campus. I could call anybody in security, like, hey, I need into this room. And so the campus ended up trusting me that much. But kind of over the same course of time, I ended up with an SSSS on every single plane ticket that I ever got. Because I was a bit of that kind of terror trying to learn how do networks work? How did this work? And so, even without my administrator privilege, like, let's go art poison the network and see what I can see and intercept all the student traffic, try to figure out what's going on, how all of this works. And, I'm going to guess somebody was watching me in college, and I ended up with a NSA intern named Ralph or whatever. And so, it was kind of dual morality, where, I'm trying to learn it the honest way, but I'm just tinkering around and like, I'm not doing anything that is hard, but wow, what can I get away with? You end up with people's passwords to their let's go log into the campus class registration system for no good reason other than like NT Landman broke passwords down into 7 character chunks. And so it's real easy to break, and art poisoning works great. And so yeah, probably long enough that there is a statute of limitations that has expired, and don't do that stuff anymore. But kind of interesting looking back on it that I'm like, I really got a lot of extra screening in the airports. Uh, and so that's kind of where I started. But at least in terms of the campus, right? They generally trusted me with access to anything I wanted, whether that was social engineering or I was just a good person. Who knows? Uh, it's probably a little bit of both. So that's kind of where I started. But when I ended up leaving college and graduating, right? So I had I think it was technically a triple major in our computer program, our biology program, and an integrated sciences, basically kind of like the pre-med, biomed type path for grad school. But it was like 2008, so the entire bottom dropped out of all the R&D markets. So I had to find something. So I ended up pulling my social network, and the first job I landed was in pharma at a clinical research organization. So CROs are basically, Michael, you have this great idea for a drug. You want to research a drug,
Mhm.
but you just want to do the hard science on it. Like, I just want to invent the drug. I don't want to have to run clinical trials. I don't want to have to pull the data. I don't want to make sure it's clinically significant. And so what they do is they contract with a CRO who has all those in house, who takes your super cool drug and then does all the stuff that kind of translates it to the FDA so that they can decide whether or not it's valid or not. Um, and so originally I started doing software development for them kind of day one, but it's 2008, so things are shifting rapidly. Um, but I ended up having a little bits to do in their their biostatistics department, which is, well, sorry, starting from the top, I worked a lot with the data collections, and so a lot of those things are paper forms, right? So it's like, hey, Michael, you're trying this new experimental drug. Do you have constipation, death, restless leg syndrome? Insert any of the ads you hear on TV. It's like, this is what we have to do, blood pressure, all that stuff. And the clinical sites collect that on paper data. We have to get that in. We have to get that in a database, and then kind of compare. We have two people enter it to make sure there aren't mistakes and all this good stuff. That's the boring part. When it gets interesting is when you get to the biostatistics department, which is actually folks who are computer scientists who have a pretty in-depth understanding of math and how to do actual math to decide, well, not to decide, but to run the math on whether or not, like, is this just because Michael's drinking too much caffeine, or is this actually an effect of the drug? And so I worked a lot with the clinical side and those guys to kind of functionally, since I was junior in my career at that point, a lot of labor arbitrage between the collection, the clinical side, and the biostatistics side to kind of fill the gaps that they had and do a little bit of everything in there. And so in that time, I got a real broad experience, not only to, how to work on site in clinical departments, because, there were times where I am literally designing Excel spreadsheets that we're going to print out so people can physically write data into them and have to make sure they line up with what the clinical department expects for that specific hospital chain to make sure that they can be mapped in by our data entry department to get into the database, and then working with the biostatistics department to kind of help out with a lot of the okay, yeah, here's a lot of just the raw data processing. They'd handle the really advanced stuff. It was almost all PhDs or PhD candidates working in there. But there's a lot of kind of low level stuff and here's how you do some basic software development to kind of like, all right, let's take these 1,000 things and make a data set out of them. And so that's kind of where I cut my teeth in a lot of this. And without naming names, in the last 5 to 10 years, you have absolutely heard the names of, in particular, vaccines that I have worked on in the past on national television, multiple. I probably can say names, but I'm not going to, just because I am not an authority on their efficacy, and I haven't read my NDA in probably 15 years. But absolutely, and it was some of my proudest moments were like, whoa, wait, we're getting this outbreak of this disease that nobody's ever seen in the US before, and they have 3 different vaccines that I have at least a fingerprint on. Like, I'm not a core contributor, but my fingerprint is on those. And they're being trialed and used on actual people. And, it's one of those things you kind of feel good about it because we put a lot of work into those. And the truth is some of them we didn't think actually worked. But, you get into an emergency situation where nothing else works. And you're like, okay, clinical trials didn't work. It didn't look above the level of the threshold in a clinical trial. But you know what? What else are these folks going to try? Let's try it, because the adverse events were not that bad. So it is therapeutic care or comfort care. I forget what the term is. Mm-hmm. And you know what? It worked better once you got out of these really narrow subsets. So, to name some things, think like Ebola or Marburg, where there's so few people with them. And it's very difficult to even run a clinical trial on them. So that's kind of where I started. Kind of going from biology background to cutting my teeth in clinical research. Not a lot of security stuff in there, other than, a real deep dive in. Actually, let me step back. The one thing that required was there is a lot of work that goes into, anything under the FDA that requires you to be able to trust your own systems. So if I say, you fill out a sheet for me, or you say, yeah, I took this drug, I got restless leg, or I have bleeding out my nose, Michael, whatever it is, right? Like, there is a lot of work that goes into, if you tell me that and you enter that, I need to prove that that is what comes out the other end. So I can trust every step of the system, because, we've all had bugs in software, right? Where it's like, hey, even if it's not security related, you buffer overruns could completely be like, actually, one of the best examples. Have you ever played Civ 2?
Yeah.
So Warlord Gandhi. Do you remember Warlord Gandhi?
Yeah.
So there was a bug in Civ 2 where over time the great leader Gandhi is supposed to become more and more peaceful. But once he gets to zero, he has a buffer overrun and goes to 1,000. And Gandhi just builds all the nukes and nukes everybody else in the game. And this is the kind of bugs that we had to be very, very careful about in the pharma land because, you know, Gandhi's supposed to be peaceful, and now he's Warlord Gandhi. And so if you go Google Warlord Gandhi, it's actually a meme, it's a thing, it's a well-known bug in the game that was never intended by the developers, just because they had a buffer overrun when they hit zero, and then they went negative, and they're now at what negative, they're now positive 32,000 or whatever a 32-bit integer is. I forget the numbers. And so we had to do a ton of work where I would spend, if we had a data collection system, I would spend a month going through putting in QA data, actual data, all this other stuff, verifying every outcome I could, verifying it all on paper, getting these binders that would fill up entire bookshelves. And so there's a ton of work just to go into, it's technically not security, but the amount of effort that went into just avoiding some of these fundamental bugs that could influence the health of people. And so if we had a Warlord Gandhi style bug in restless leg syndrome, man, they'd probably kick through a wall, or whatever, whatever medical thing you're thinking about. And so ton of work in there. Then next, I decided to get out of clinical research because it was a lot of paperwork, a lot, you develop 10% of the time and you prove that what you developed works the other 90%. And I know a lot of people will complain about like, pharma is so expensive, all this stuff is so slow. And you know what? It's because the entire industry, every regulation they have is written in blood. Like there's very few that you cannot go back to like, and people died. That's why we do it this way. And it all ends up, right? Like, it's one of my pet peeves that I run into with the family. Like, well, where are those regulations come from? It's like, well, when I worked in pharma, have you ever heard about thalidomide? Or, whatever else it was, like all these drugs that went horribly wrong. And like, yeah, we're never going to do that again. But it was a lot of work. It kind of burned me out for a little bit. I did that for about 5 years. And so the next up, I went into kind of a B2C where we actually did think SoundCloud or Spotify, where we ended up doing a whole bunch of kind of B2C music stuff where we had a bunch of different products. And some of the cool ones were, like, let's say you have a band, Michael, and you go play at Irregardless Cafe up in Chapel Hill, and you're looking for other places to play at. And we're like, you know what? This person, this one have played there. They've gotten good reviews, just like Michael has there. Let's go ahead and try to hook them up. And so we had like a dating service for venues and musicians, and we tried to go and have all sorts of cool stuff. Like if you were having a television show and wanted to have music that sounded like Jimi Hendrix Purple Haze, but you didn't have the budget for it, as kind of Apple TV or Netflix, right? Their budgets are getting crunched. You could be like, let me upload this and see what they come back with. And so we'd be like, hey, musicians, you give us a non-exclusive license. If anyone wants you, we'll license you to them. You can get into a television show. All this kind of cool stuff where we try to do like, what is that? Shazam type for A&R. We try to do dating service musicians. We did ad stuff, all sorts of great stuff. And, kind of in my career, this is the first time I got hacked a few times.
Really?
In a couple of different ways. We had outages. So, and some of them were actually my fault. I'll admit that. So the first one was, we were actually trying to invent that dating service where we tried to figure out, what venues do you want to, kind of what tier of musician are you at, and what venues would you be good at given their audience, and all sorts of other stuff, trying to kind of, it's like a Tinder, not a Tinder. It's more advanced than a Tinder, right? Like, because we know who you dated before and we know if they liked you. And so we take it and be like, yeah. Michael in this place had a pretty good relationship for 6 months. And we know this other place that Michael had a good relationship, had a good relationship for 6 months. You should probably date Michael's ex. Way more advanced than kind of a Tinder. But it was really complicated, and it was software perspective, we had giant MapReduce where we had to go and we had to mine all of our internal data. We had to mine Facebook, we had to mine LinkedIn, all these other data sources. And I was in charge of setting up Elasticsearch because this was brand new, like Elasticsearch version 1.0, as well as Kafka version, I think 0.11, were the two technologies we bit off, brand new. Um, I left a port open on Elasticsearch. One of the critical things about Elasticsearch is you can run arbitrary scripts inside of it. Um, at that time, you could run whatever you wanted. Bash, Python, Java, you name it. It was arbitrary code injection to the surface. And I screwed up. I left that port open. I didn't know about it. I didn't think about it. Um, and then we start having some load issues. And we're like, what's going on? In the end, we ended up digging through that and we're like, we had enough logging and stuff in place that we're able to go through and understand, hey, this is what they did. We have almost every command recorded. Oh, that was a screw up, but it was mostly they were trying to make us part of their bot machine. No user data was compromised, but it was kind of a wake up call. Then the second one was the FBI stopped by.
Wow.
Um, oh yeah. This is about the time I was departing from there, but everything happened under while I was there. So this is early in the days of AWS where you really didn't have like IAM and kind of the delegated permissions. And at some point, a developer had committed our root keys for production to our Git repository and pushed it up to GitHub. They then deleted that and did not purge the Git history. And so what happened is GitHub was hacked, and they had this random commit in the middle of our Git tree that had been put in and deleted. They found that. They got our database backups from AWS, and then they were for sale on the dark market. And the FBI comes on like, hey, your database backups are for sale, bro. You're like, wait, what? And talk about things that, kind of were out of scope for things that people would see all the time. Like, we knew that these are things you should commit, but somebody committed them and then deleted them, but it was still in the commit history. They went through it. And now there's a whole bunch of tools like Trufflehog just to look for these mistakes that people make. But yeah, yeah. So then we had that. There are probably a couple others in there along the way. Ruby on it was a Ruby on Rails product, so move fast, break things. Lots of sharp edges in there, lots of mistakes made. But those are all kind of the two times, at least on short notice. I'm like, yeah, I got wrecked by a third party. Um,
None of the top 50 university programs teach secure coding in their curriculum. At Security Journey, we help enterprises reduce vulnerabilities through application security education for developers and everyone in the SDLC. With almost 700 up-to-date lessons created by industry-leading security experts and a programmatic approach that creates security champions, our programs have increased AppSec knowledge by as much as 85%. Visit securityjourney.com to try our training today.
After that, I moved on to kind of my first medical device. And so, I had like 5 years in pharma, which is developing compounds that get injected into your body. Medical devices are more like ultrasounds, toothbrushes, CAT scans, cardiac stents. There's kind of three tiers of them, right? Which is toothbrush being the lowest one. We're like, Michael, if you hurt yourself with this toothbrush, I'm going to judge you as a person. And on the high end, it's like a pacemaker. It's like, you know what? That pacemaker's the fault. That hurts you. That's on the manufacturer. And they break them into three broad categories, with the in between being like, well, it's an ultrasound. So if somebody does something bad, you can have harm, but there's a doctor there to shield you at all times. Not a good definition, but kind of at least how I'd one sentence the middle ground. And so with that one, we were basically a PAC system, which is picture acquisition and capture. So you have ultrasounds, X-rays, insert any sort of medical imaging, right? Those images have to go somewhere. And historically, kind of before, what we were working on was you'd have the ultrasound. It would be hardwired into the network, go into something in the room. If you were the ultrasound tech, Michael, you'd roll your rolly chair over the other side of the room and go look at the thing with the screen on it and decide what's going on. And so kind of what our market was great. The ultrasound tech and the doctor don't need to be physically co-located. You don't need did you ever have a mini disc player, Michael?
I did back in the day.
Yeah, a magneto-optical disc. So in ultrasound world, like that is what they stored everything. It wasn't like data tapes. It was magneto-optical. It was the industrial grade mini disc. And so that's what they stored it on for the longest time. And so we tried to take that and turn it from like this hard drive mini disc thing in the corner or in the next room over to being in the cloud and do a SaaS thing for medical imaging. And so instead of you rolling over to the next room over to go and look at that image, right? Like we actually had a whole industry around. Like you could have retired. You've done 20 years as a doctor, as a cardiologist, whatever you were. Go live in your RV, get some HughesNet satellite or whatever the satellite internet was at the time, and go and review like 100 of these a day, and pass your medical judgment on mostly, is this normal or should you go see the specialist? Which is a lot of what kind of the screening was, or is this better or worse or maintaining? And so, as a medical professional, they loved it because they could, we had so many that would go get in RVs and just go live in the middle of some national park, spend 2 hours a day reviewing medical imaging. And, that was their whole life, right? They'd just get paid for every exam they reviewed and they just chill like quasi retirement. Amazing. I would love to be able to do that at the age of 50, right? Like just retire to a park. Like I did this for 30 years. Let me just go and look at a couple of pictures on my computer and say yes or no. Um, for an hour a day while I'm drinking my coffee. And so kind of what we did was like our entire business model was around getting that from being on-prem, on those disks, on those magneto-optical to in the cloud. And we had so many issues. Like this is one of the places where I just wanted to rip my hair out and scream almost every day. So a lot of the images came across in a medical standard format known as DICOM, which is think XML document with a JPEG image in it when you really get down to it. Every vendor we had a non-conformance statement. So if you had name a vendor that's not medical.
A vendor that's not medical? Man, we
Yeah, like a food vendor or a car vendor, just so I don't call anyone out.
Let's go Honda, huh?
Yeah. So let's talk about cars, right?
Yeah.
So let's say, you had a Honda, a Toyota, a Ford, and a Dodge.
Yeah.
You get in there, right? You expect to be able to sit down in that chair and be able to operate it within about 30 seconds, right? Like you can rent a car and they're standardized enough that like gas pedals on the right, brakes in the middle or on the left, clutches on the left. Maybe there's a stick shift. And the worst thing you have to deal with, like, where's the shifter? Is it on the tree? Is it on the floor? Is it where's the cruise control? Things like that. Like that's most of what you have to deal with in borrowing a new car. But every vendor we get in, you'd have a non-conformance statement by vendor. They'd have this is our medical imaging standard. But Honda's like, no. We only do this part over here. And then on this type of device, like let's say you had a pickup truck, like, yeah. We don't have a shifter. We have you have to slide right or left in the seat. So that's our non-conformance statement there. And then you get into the like the F-150 versus the F-350, and they're like, oh, well, to turn the headlight, you have to bang your head against the back headrest. And every one of them had these non-conformance statements on the way in. Which is one of the things that drove me insane is all the standards were non-standard. And they weren't even modern, right? And so most of what we dealt with was video formats. Mm-hmm. Let's have an echocardiogram. So we specialized in echocardiograms where you actually see the heart do bum, 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 bum. But no, you get 1,000 files that are individual JPEG images. And, talk about whole things where they're just like, this is all out of date. Nobody follows it. It frustrates me. But since this is security talk, where we really got into issues was what you call HL7, which is health level 7. It's a protocol for interacting between different medical devices and say, let's say you are a doctor and you want to order me a echocardiogram and prescribe me a blood thinner, right? Like you go into your medical system. This is you typing because I've seen you type before. And you punch that into my EHR, and that would actually send off orders to other systems. Most of the time, that would be over the HL7 protocol. Well, let me ask you this. When do you think the HL7B2 protocol was formally published?
It's a great question. Last year?
Come,
No.
come on, man. Make a guess.
From the original, let's go, I don't know, 2010.
Oh, we're done. You're not even close. HL7V2, if I remember correctly, and don't take my word for this. We'll
Yeah.
look it up afterwards and insert the correction in a cut right here. 1989.
Wow.
And so this is that when I was working in 2010 to 2015 in this field was the most up-to-date standard for this protocol. 1989. When do you think token ring and Ethernet really became a thing?
Man, that's crazy.
Yeah, it was about that same time, maybe a little later. And so you
Yeah.
have this medical protocol that is basically Telnet that was designed for point-to-point connections in a hospital, right? Like, I'm going to physically plug this in here, physically plug this in there. Great, perfectly well-intentioned protocol because it was designed for direct connections. No issues when you talk about in that context. But when you talk about it in the context when I was working on 2015 and switched packet systems, Ethernet,
That's
we had a lot of issues. And so one of the ones that really stood out to me was we had a hospital network we were working at. And of course, I won't name it, but let's just say pick a city with 500,000 people, pick one of the two hospital networks in that city. And that was who we were working with. They serviced 250,000 people, had every specialty under the hood, probably, really specialized in half of them. Like, hospital network A does, joints and knees. Hospital network B does cardiology. And so we had this hospital network that we were working with, and it consumed probably 4 to 6 months of my life. Where it started out with was, when we have one of those DICOMs come in, we have the doctor review it. They're like, hey, yeah, this is a normal heart, great, whatever. Or no, they need to see the cardiologist. What we would end up doing is after we got that message from the physician, send a message back to the EHR system or whatever it is, being like, hey, you need to schedule some other appointment. And so the HL7 is a lot of the integration between systems of, hey, Michael just had this echocardiogram. The doctor said it looks kind of funky. Let's go get his, arteries scrubbed out or whatever it is, or get him on some blood thinners. And so a lot of what this protocol is talking between different hospital systems. And so one of the things that we were obligated to do was actually send that back. And so, the doctor comes in, he reads the echocardiogram, like, that looks like some cholesterol. We need to get him to see a specialist on site and get past that initial screening phase. And so we'd send something back into their EHR, their health record system, that would tell whoever's doing scheduling to go and schedule it. But it's way more complicated than under the hood because you have this generic protocol that does everything from ordering tests to updating records to ordering pills to anything inside of a hospital. Like this thing was overloaded to do. And so the first time I ran into this was I would send updates to one of my hospitals. And it's for us, right? Like I come from a SaaS background. Open a connection, send a bunch of messages to Michael, shut it down. Right? Like that seems reasonable. Open the mailbox, toss some letters in, let the post office pick them up. And so they'd take them, they'd accept them, they'd send me an ACK, I'd shut down the connections. And the next thing I know is I have a tar pit where after like a week, every connection I open with just hangs. And so I go from having, like one or two processes that integrates with all of our hospitals and networks that we work with to being like, why does this one hospital have 50 of these? And I ended up having to get on the phone with kind of their HL7 guy. And what I learned, and this is kind of my first foray into this protocol and why it drove me insane, was what would happen is they had a couple of expectations. I'm going to guess three. The first one is that since this protocol back in the day was always point to point, direct connect, is that the connection was always live between both systems. They expected a single TCP connection, always connected, always live. And so I'm like, hey, what's going on with my system? And his response is like, well, why don't I see you active in my system? Well, I send you messages and I shut down. It's like, no, that's not how anything else I have works. And he's like, wait, what? That's not how software works these days. This is 2015. You open a connection, you send data, you shut it down. And so, kind of the first two layers that I learned about in this protocol was this protocol has no authentication or authorization or encryption. It is completely plain text. It's basically Telnet. And so my partner at the other site at the hospital, who I was extremely frustrated with at the time, he has to explain this to me and teach me as somebody who hasn't worked in there. But the only ways they have of controlling access to this are twofold. Number one, they have overloaded it and wrapped it with TLS encryption, which is not standard in the protocol. You do HTTP. HTTP
Hmm.
doesn't know about HTTPS or TLS, but it's really well built into the servers and the browsers and all that stuff. They have to do it as a transparent a transparent bridge.
Hmm.
It was never built into the system, and it still isn't. And so that's the first one. It's like it doesn't have TLS. It doesn't have authentication either. Like if you ended up hacking the ultrasound machine and running arbitrary software on it, you could order me all the fentanyl I wanted and send that off to the
Wow.
pharmacy if you just formatted the message right, because it has no, by default, the protocol really has no understanding of whether or not this message is from an authenticated sender or not, or what that's authenticated to do. Because remember, it was designed to be this point to point, physically wired, hardwired, trusted connection. And so what he ended up doing is, they built TLS onto it as kind of an afterthought. And then as a security measure, they limited us to two TCP connections. Um, I couldn't have any more. And so what would happen is we'd open one, we'd fire some messages off, they'd send us an ACK being like, okay,
Hmm.
but they would also expect us to behave a lot like some of their really old machines and still be there listening. And so what we do is we'd hang up after they said, good to go, and they'd end up putting the outbound messages onto the wire, and we'd have a half open TCP connection still. And so at the same time that they were tar pitting me as a response, I was DOSing them with half open TCP connections because they could only have 32,000 of these or whatever the Windows stack at that time was. Um, because that's what they had. And this is all because this protocol that was built in the probably designed in the 70s, ratified in the 80s, was still present in the 90s. And nobody had done anything significant to at least across the industry to update it. And I'm going to be very hard here. And the truth is like they had more modern standards. Like there was
Hmm.
HL7v3 with Fire, which is an XML version, which don't get me started on XML. And I think we have a lesson on external entities and XML I learned about.
We got a handful of those.
Yeah. I got my gripes against XML, but I'm like, at least in like 2010, they were trying to have a new version of this. But the issue is severalfold, right? So the first one is the medical vendors had no intention of ever updating the software on these devices unless it was killing people, right? Like, what is the financial incentive
Yeah.
once you ship a, CAT scan, ultrasound, X-ray, whatever it is? That's a lot of investment in software that's probably really bespoke, used on 20 machines. The dude who wrote it probably spent his entire career on it and then retired. Like it's a huge investment to maintain them. And so number one, a lot of the software on those devices was never meant to be updated ever because there's twofold. There's no financial incentive because the X-ray or ultrasound or CAT scan works.
Hmm.
Number one, and number two. Remember the time I mentioned that it takes to validate,
Hmm.
our just data entry systems? I'd spend a month on medical record systems. Can you imagine how long it takes to do an X-ray to prove that that thing after a software update still works like it's supposed to? It's a lot of time. And if you're talking about a hospital, right? Like not only do you have to update the software, but that is downtime. So there's no incentive for the hospital network to update their software because that's downtime, that's work, that's labor, it's expensive. I'm going to guess that to update um, X-ray or an ultrasound or an X-ray or a CAT scan, it's probably $500,000 in labor and downtime easily. I of course have no insight into that, but it is expensive. And then number three, and this is the best one. We're going to circle back to that guy who had those machines a little bit. I spent a lot of time with that guy. Um, one of the other issues I had was to bridge our two systems, right? To bridge that old HL7 DICOM type thing with our SaaS software, we had an on-prem little jiblet that ran that basically just was a translator, right? I will listen to your format, I will translate it, I will upload it to the cloud. Fairly simple software, needs to be reasonably performant because they had no concept of video, right? So if you're doing anything that has animations, instead of getting, like a 2 megabyte MP4, you're getting 10,000 JPEG images coming up. And so it had to be a little performant, a little smart. One of the other issues we had with this same hospital network was one day, I think this was Windows 7 was being sunsetted. Of course, this is like well after Windows 10. So you're talking at least 5 years sunsetted, extended support already. And I updated TLS to not support SSLv2. So, we have our web-bound, HTTP portal. And I got, TLS 1.2 is now the standard. You go to Google, you go to Bing, you go to anybody that's worth their salt, TLS 1.2. They were still serving SSL 1, I think it was 2. I think it was 2 at that time. And so, of course, we had a security audit. I'm like, yeah, we got to shut this down. I'm like, okay, that seems perfectly reasonable. So I turned it off. 30 minutes later, I get a call from this hospital. Well, it comes through support, but, we get a call from this hospital. We can't upload anything. Like, the timing is candid that this is what's happening. And so I'm like, okay, let me undo what I just did because I, have avid notes and tickets and, have a workflow for all these things. And so what it turned out is that their machine was so old, it didn't support anything beyond SSLv2 because it was on Windows, I think 7 at the time when Windows 10 was a standard, like Windows 10 SP2 was a standard. Like if you went to Microsoft, they wouldn't sell you anything less than it. And in that bit of software, we dynamically link to the SSL libraries. And so whatever the OS supported is what we supported. And so I turned it off and they just couldn't talk with us. And so here I am, like 5 years after this thing has been EOL'd. And like, it can't talk to us because we don't support modern SSL. And you're like, seriously? And so, we had to do a couple of, we turned it back on because I had to paperwork out the risk assessment because it's pharma and hospital and all that stuff. And so you get on a whole nother call with them and we start working through it. And I have one guy who's working on, okay, can I rebuild this software? I know you've worked on old .NET software, right? Like you've dusted off .NET software and tried to get it to build. And so I had a guy working on trying to get this 5-year-old .NET software that they were working on to build with statically linked SSL. And that's one path, and ended up getting on a call with them to their entire IT department, which this is another thing that really ground my gears is like we have 2 people on our side. They had over 20 to talk about integrating my SaaS software with their ultrasound machines or whatever it was. I think it was nuclear is what they called it. I'm like, why do I need to talk to your desktop people? Why do I need to talk to your Citrix people? Why do I need to talk to your VPN people? None of this has anything to do with it. And so you had this gigantic 20-person decision by committee thing that I had to talk about. Guys, can you just update your Windows? Because it's already EOL, it's out of support. And so, digging in, and this took a while to get to, is that remember what I said about the software vendors never wanting to update their software? The number that I remember is that to go from a Windows 7 to a Windows 10 version was $100,000 in software licensing. They already paid for this machine. Let's say it's a $10 million whatchamajig. Like, you want to update your Windows? An extra $100,000. Not only did they have to pay the licensing fee for that, but then they would have to take it offline, update it, and validate it, or reintegrate it with the system with no promise it's going to work. And so you have this like trifecta of there is absolutely no incentive to update to modern standards. So we have this HL7 protocol from the 80s that is designed for direct connect, not for switch networks, has no inbuilt encryption, has no authentication, has no authorization, running on machines that are running software from the 80s themselves that are integrating with modern systems. And then you're like, hey, can you just update your Windows OS? And they're like, no, because it costs us 100 grand. And the best part about this is finally we worked through it and like, okay, we're going to do kind of a point to point VPN connection with you guys. That way the VPN can have whatever encryption we think is appropriate for medical information. And you guys aren't forced to update and pay that $100,000. Do you know what happened to my antivirus?
Hmm.
It
Oh,
started screaming on day one.
I was about to say
That
it went on the
machine
fritz.
was infected with Conflicker, and they knew about it. And they paperworked it out of it because it was too expensive to disinfect it, reinstall it, and revalidate it. And so we isolated it on the network, and I was like screaming internally the whole time. And all this had to do with the cost and the cadence of what they were updating. Like it just was never meant to be updated. Um, and so like there's literally this hospital with this medical imaging device handling your PHI that has Conflicker on it that's 5 years out of date that Microsoft doesn't support and sets off every basic security standard that I have for that year. And it starts screaming at me. My third party audits are like, bro, you shouldn't support this. My antivirus is yelling at me like, this traffic is sketchy. All of it. And this was business as usual for them. Um, and the truth is I don't blame any of my counterparts there. Like they're stuck with what they're stuck with because I had hey, I was in town, like, let's go get a beer, dude, after we spent like 3 months working through all this.
Yeah.
And that machine that the one that was really a thorn in my side was purchased in like the early 90s. It was more than 20 years old. It hadn't had software updates. And so, of course, by like early 90s standard, like, great, it's perfectly up to date. But the medical device manufacturer didn't have incentive to update it. And when the hospital had incentive to update it, it was expensive and they didn't want to do it. And so you end up with this tar pit of, you get this brand new machine today. Let's say you buy the brand spanking this new MRI or whatever it is. You still have one from 30 years ago. And somehow these all need to play with the same core systems. And so the ability to sunset old protocols is almost impossible because there is no incentive there. And one of the things I was most happiest about, ended up getting out of medical devices and getting back into them because there's a lot of those in the Raleigh-Durham area, is when the FDA actually started forcing cybersecurity standards. And I had a buddy whose medical device failed their cybersecurity for the FDA. I of course, can't go into detail on it just
Right.
because, but I was happy because it meant that there was actually pressure to be like, can you guys actually have software updates? Can you have modern SaaS security standards? Um, and all of this, right? Like all this starts with the protocol from the 90s that couldn't be updated in firmware without paying $100,000, that couldn't be updated on an OS that was out of date, that was infected with this, that had old TLS libs. And you're like, how hard is it to just update a TLS library? And really what it was is Microsoft forced it. When you start looking into the changelogs, you're like, yeah, we're going to stop patching the TLS libraries for Windows 7, I think it was, because it should have been done years ago. But they finally pulled the trigger, like, no. They said no, and I respect them for saying no. Because at that point, you're like, it forced this issue, and I don't remember how it resolved, but, like, this dude I was working with was like, dude, I have to make all these systems talk together, and I got to make stuff from the 70s talk to stuff from 2015. And so you have the lowest common denominator protocol in place that can never be updated. And that's really where it comes down to. To me, it was always an industry flaw of incentivization. And it's twofold, right? On the one side, updating these things has tremendous cost. On the other side, it actually could potentially harm patients. If you update that firmware for that X-ray machine, you don't know if it's going to result in a different diagnosis.
Right.
And so there's always risk of doing harm to a patient. And so that you kind of have the two conflicting sides of that where I understand it, but I hate it. Um,
It's crazy. So I listen to all this, right? And you I think most people would be surprised for this type of insight. When we think medical places, like I go to a hospital, we go to the doctor's office, any of these places, we see shiny objects, white and clean, like everything seems so modern for the most majority of hospitals you walk into nowadays. But if you like crack behind the scenes, understanding like what's running in the background might not be as slick as what it looks like in the foreground, right? I think that there's an absolute assumption, though, that, man, hospitals have so much money, right? They must have the best, newest, like pushing out software and backing up and developer audiences and everything else. And the reality is kind of more like government, right? It's actually, interestingly enough, way more like government, which is spaces like the things that you're seeing ring true to me too, right? You're still seeing Windows 7 that was being supported, but when I got out in 2017, 2018 timeframe, that's what was happening, right? Like you would still see Windows 7 systems being used, and they're like, we can't update them. Like it's just not possible. Right, we would have to completely rebuild a new product and replace them, and the budget just wasn't there. But it's interesting when you think about the hospitals, right? Because they're not like restaurants; they're not running thin margin lines. Like you'd think they'd have some more flexibility, but I think that there's a different driver there, right? The medicine's the driver. Like the desire for cyber, that's not the driver for anybody making decisions in those architectures. So it comes down to that regulation, that requirement, the FDA, all these other people. They like, we have to demand they do it. Otherwise, people just don't do it. They're not going to. It's expensive. It takes time.
Absolutely. And I have two thoughts in there. The first one, of course, is the individual hospitals don't have the leverage to kind of force a modern standard. They have to get together, or it has to come from the government. And, this is one of those few places I'm like, I have been in this trench, and I don't think anyone outside of the government or a huge lawsuit could motivate anyone to do it, right? Like it is risk of monetary damages is the only way to start standardizing this. But the other bit that you hit on is you're talking about a hospital like a monolith. And if you ever actually, this is one of the things that I learned, that the fun way is that every single department in a hospital is often a different company. So the ER is run by one company, has their own devices, has their own staff. The ICU is a whole nother one. The cardiac department, and in some cases, this is just let's play the corporate shell game, right? But in other cases, it's entirely different companies that are physically co-located in the same building doing cross-billing and stuff. And you say it's like government, and that portion reminds me of it, where like the ER might have their own ultrasounds, they might have their own software, but it still has to integrate with EHR. And so a lot of the hospital networks end up becoming more of a conglomerate of vendors as opposed to a single entity. And so they don't often have the leverage, even within their own physical building, to force anything.
Yeah, that rings so true. And I've worked a decent amount in a hospital, and you're right. It's like a mall, or it's like a little city, right? Everything's so decentralized. Like they have systems that have to talk, right? You have to share patient information. You have to be able to interact from one and to the other. But they are so siloed, right? You could spend a whole month working in a hospital and never see anything but the one department area you're ever going to work in, and never look at anything else, right? It's like these mini cities. It's interesting when you think about the way that the security has to apply to that too, right? It's like it's not like us, right? You're not applying security across our mini org, right? Where we might have a couple departments, but like we're pretty well intertwined. You're like trying to roll out cyber and secure standards across a city with a bunch of different companies trying to work together.
Exactly, right. It's like downtown insert city and having to get them all to work together and play nice.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And then you have the EMR for the medical records. You have the pharmacy management system. You have the automated dispensing. You have the systems that dispense the uniforms for the nurses and the other staff to make sure they're sterile. Just all sorts of ones. And kind of one of the most interesting hacks I ever found was, at least in that field, was there was a hospital with a pneumatic tube system. Like, hey, let's take a blood sample, shoot it off to the lab. Turns out that thing had hard-coded passwords, outdated Linux systems, and pen tester totally owned it, and it was on the trusted network. And now your pneumatic tube system has the ability to order. and it wasn't fully isolated from, at least this is going from memory, it wasn't fully isolated from like the HL7 network because it was trusted. So now your pneumatic tube system can order you an overdose of insulin or whatever. And then it's only up to the medical staff to be like, that doesn't seem right.
Right.
And just there's number one, too much implicit trust because none of them know how to work together. And then, yeah, they're all competing. I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but yeah.
Yeah, I totally what you're saying. Here's the thing that like drives home is you would think this is the opposite for these places, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you were ever to ask me what is mission critical software, I'd walk around a hospital and say everything in here I would call mission critical software because it affects whether people live or die. Even if you talk about something as simple as a sterilization, like that's massive. That's massive. If uniforms aren't being sterilized properly between usage, you're going to spread disease. People will die.
And to put it in perspective, when I worked in the medical imaging side of this and working on those systems, the absolute worst thing we could do is mix up two images.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you and I both had an echocardiogram or something else, and I needed heart surgery, you did not, but we flopped those images. You're going to get a surgery you don't need, and I'm probably going to die.
Yeah.
And that is the level of risk that comes with these bugs. And that's just a standard bug of, off by one error. Like, let's just misindex these images. And then you're talking about, like, I can actually inject random garbage into your system. Like, I have no idea. As a trusted partner, like, I have no idea how much damage I could have done. I could have just put garbage in for every patient they have. And it was absurd, the level of trust. Authorization, authentication are very near and dear to me because I have seen the risk associated with those getting screwed up.
One of the interesting parts for me thinking about this too, though, is like from human standards, right? Human practices in a hospital, like you double, triple check everything before you do anything, right? Like a nurse gives a drug, they ask your name 3 times, your birth date, they read the label 3 times, check the dose 3 times before they administer, right? Like that is core practice to protect patients. Mm-hmm. But we're running off a machine that might not even have input validation, right? Like it's the idea of like, wait a minute, we missed the mark somewhere.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. And the whole time, right, it really built my respect for the people in the hospital because I looking in the back and I'm like, there's so much stuff that can go wrong. But you know what? I still trust that nurse to be like, that doesn't look right for this patient. Which, to be clear, was like the distinction between a class 2 and a class 3 medical device, right? Like class 2 was always, there's a human who can call like, no, I need to double check this. But class 3 was like the pacemaker where it's inside of you. And then even those, right? Like you look at medical devices. Have you seen the insulin pump hacks that have been out there or the pacemaker hacks?
I haven't seen those, no.
So there is an entire class. So this is actually kind of my 3rd stint inside of pharma, or my 2.5 stint. Is you start to get into medical devices, and there's a real push to make them connected for a couple of reasons, right? So, like, let's say you get a pacemaker. As your doctor, I want to be able to update the settings or whatever the tuning is for it. And so with a lot of those, right, like there's a little giblet like right here in your shoulder where they can put on a magnety whatever and talk to it and kind of reprogram it. Our former Vice President, Dick Cheney, had the remote software for his pacemaker disabled because they could be, if you were in proximity, you could artificially influence it. In the same vein, there are actually a number of insulin pumps that have a similar vulnerability where they wanted to have kind of, insulin pumps, great, huge quality of life improvement, but they had some of these remotes that were just like in the pocket. They're not Bluetooth, they're not whatever. I'd have to research it again. But if you had like a Flicker Zero, right, like you could program that to just blast out, give them whatever lethal dose of insulin you want within the transmit radius, because they didn't really have the authentication or authorization in them either. And you can go out and look these up. I think there's actually FDA like security briefs, which are very rare, where you can just go out and be like, who wants an overdose of insulin? And that's not even counting the standard bugs. Like there was a whole nother bug inside of an insulin pump where if the batteries died, and you replace the batteries, it would reset the how much insulin you've had today to zero. So let's say you had your max safe dose of insulin for the day. You just replace the batteries. Like, great, you can have a whole nother day's worth of insulin. Um, and just all these little bugs in software that are, a lot of them are either security or tangentially, right? Like, so the ones where you get the remote and you can spoof the remote, absolutely security issue, right? There's no authentication, authorization. You can kill people. The ones where it's like, great, we didn't persist the counter to memory. Well, there's a whole nother subset that are at least tangential to security that's like, this is unsafe data practices that can get somebody killed. And there's whole testimonies. I think there's actually a presentation at DEF CON for the latter one where he replaced the batteries and almost died. And I think it was his presenter at DEF CON. So perfect venue for this. Um, and yeah, in one of the products that I was supposed to work on, they wanted to do medical data over Bluetooth, and I had to scream about it. Like, no, I don't trust Bluetooth for this. You want to do Wi-Fi? Maybe. Bluetooth? No. Because here, let me get this Raspberry Pi and spoof it. And then the interesting was is two of my coworkers ended up going to kind of a cybersecurity and medical device conference, and they were talking about the insecurity of Bluetooth. And I'm like, yes, I'm vindicated because
Yeah.
I rose a stunk about that. It was one of those that probably got me in trouble. Um, but and it's always this trade-off, right? Like, how secure are these things? Um, like, how secure is your insulin pump? I don't know. There's definitely some vulnerabilities in the wild that could get you way too much insulin. Um, and then, the third stint in there, I was working with medical devices, and the part that drove me insane was the firmware updates. Like, it just like there are some standardized ways to do this, but we had both firmware updates and bugs that were just so difficult to do. Like, we functionally had like recalls and multiple recalls in a week, or what probably borderlined on it, because the firmware was botched and we bricked machines and all this stuff.
I think the terrifying part about this too, for medical devices, I think as far as like end user assumption that it's flawless. I think that's inherently the assumption that we monitor so much, we test our drugs so much, we test all our medications so much, we go through all this process. My assumption is the medical device you're giving me or having me use has been just as rigorously identified and tested and worked through and developed and built just like you would a drug to me, right? That's the assumption the audience has.
Hmm.
It's a very false assumption that I think we are putting regulations in there, right? But I think that the fact is though is I don't think it is nearly as that assumption can't be as true as we put it to other things.
You're hitting an absolute nail on the head. So when we talk about drugs, right, like there is a standard that they have to beat. And in Europe, has to work better than something on the market. In the US, it has to work better than the placebo. And again, I haven't been in this field in like 10 years. So, check Wikipedia before you quote me. And so that's the standard for medication. But when you get into medical devices, they hold it to the standard of what came before it. And there is a long-standing study of hip implants where the first hip implants that went in for like replacement hips were very well studied, very well characterized. And then over 20 years, they got to middle on middle and like, yeah, it works roughly the same as the other ones that we have out there. And you had kind of the sliding scale of we're only going to compare it to the other stuff on the market. And, you probably saw the recalls for hip implants where they had this black goo inside of the hips because they ground together. And I forget the specifics of it because this is something we probably want to talk to somebody a little more up to date than I am with.
Yeah.
But particularly on the device side, there is this sliding scale that does not have the same rigor as the pharma side, where it's mostly comparing it to what's already there. Um, and I forget the details, but the hip implant one is probably the best modern example where these hip implants that worked for 30 years just fine suddenly started having catastrophic injuries and reducing people's hips to, I believe it was a sponge, is how it was described to me, because they had this sliding scale of, oh, yeah, we've had hip implants approved. This is roughly a hip implant. It should still be good, as opposed to holding it to the original standard. It kind of holds it to the ballpark of what came before it. And so you can get this kind of sliding scale of what the quality is.
Yeah, that's crazy. It's crazy when you think about these things. These things are so critical to our day-to-day lives. All right, Adam, this has been a great conversation. We're coming at the cap of an hour, so I'm going to be wrapping this up here.
Cool.
This is such great insight into an industry that I think that people don't appreciate the complexity of, as well as how ingrained software and hardware and like technical debt I think that exists out in the industry that just hasn't been tackled and is completely vulnerable. So something to think about as you make your decisions on your next medical device. Do a little research into, hey, is this something that's open source software that's been maintained by one guy for 10 years? Like, what am I looking at here that's getting put in my device, right? But definitely like great insight. Any last parting thoughts before we kind of wrap it up?
Like my big thought is everything I've seen in the industry seems to be going in the right direction. And like I said, I had a buddy whose device was rejected because it didn't meet the updated cybersecurity requirements. And so I think there is traction in a good direction. We just need to keep pushing on that and make sure it keeps up.
Yeah, and that's great. Some silver lining to the fact that not all doom, right? We're doing the right things. We're starting to move in that right direction.
Big hole to dig out of.
Got some debt to take care of, I think, in this. But part of this, I think, would take away from my audience, if you are in the industry, right? If you're in the medical industry, understand why security education is so important, right? Understand why security practices, core basic stuff, input validation. Make sure we don't have a buffer overflow, right? Some of the fundamental security practices that every developer should be aware of. So crucial to what we're doing. Hey, Adam, thank you for your time. It's been a great conversation, great information for us. And for my audience, thank you for jumping on. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Security Champions podcast. And remember, security is a journey, not a destination.